On June 12, 1942, Anne Frank received a diary for her 13th birthday and began writing about her life as a Jewish girl in Amsterdam under Nazi occupation. For 761 days, hidden in the Secret Annex, she recorded her fears, her hopes, her first love, and the terror of living locked away with 7 other people in a space smaller than an apartment. On August 4, 1944, the Gestapo broke into the hiding place and dragged all 8 of them out. Anne was only 15 years old. The diary was left lying on the floor of the annex and was found by Miep Gies, a friend of the family who risked her own life by hiding them for nearly 2 years. And at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you where the Gestapo took Anne Frank, what she faced in the last months of her life, and why she died only weeks before she was to be liberated, when the war was already practically over. Before the video begins, we're on our way to the goal of 1 million subscribers. It sounds like a lot, but with your help, we'll get there. So subscribe to the channel now. Also, take a moment to leave a like and be part of this story. It was June 12, 1929. The life of a Jewish family living in Frankfurt, Germany was becoming happier at that moment. A girl came into the world who would be given the name Anneliese Marie Frank, the protagonist of today's video. At that moment, no one could have imagined that the birth of that child, celebrated simply among family members, would be linked to one of the best-known and most impactful stories of the 20th century. A path that years later would come to symbolize both hope and the brutality of one of the darkest periods in human history. Up to that point, the world around the Franks seemed quite stable and, in a way, predictable. Otto Frank, Anne's father, was a cultured man with very firm principles who believed deeply in Germany as his homeland. He values education, discipline, and honest work as fundamental pillars for building a dignified life. Edith Frank, the mother, raises her children with great affection, but also with a sense of responsibility and organization. Margot, 3 years older than Anne, is serious, studious, and more reserved, often preferring the quiet of books to more boisterous play. Anne, on the other hand, is the opposite: curious, talkative, full of energy, and with a vivid imagination. She makes friends easily, likes to talk and observe everything around her, showing from a very early age a special interest in words and stories. Even then, she dreamed of becoming a writer. Although he did not know exactly how this dream might come true in the future, the family lived in Marbach, in a quiet part of the city. The children on the block played in the garden almost every day, running between the houses and sharing games, laughter, and the small adventures typical of childhood. The Franks were Jewish, but they lived in a more liberal way, fully integrated into the country where they lived. They were friends with both Jewish and non-Jewish families. They went to the same places, took part in the same activities, and shared the same daily routine. Religious difference had never truly seemed to matter, neither to them nor to the neighbors around them. There was a sense of belonging, as if that were, without any doubt, the place where they could build their future in safety. But only until that moment. We now move on to January 30th, 1933, a date that would change everything. And the reason is simple. It is the moment when Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany by then-President Paul von Hindenburg. Within weeks, the Nazi regime begins to dismantle the civil rights of the entire population. Laws begin to restrict basic freedoms. Political opponents are persecuted and silenced. And the first concentration camps are created to hold those considered undesirable by the new government: political opponents, homosexuals, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, among others. The machinery of exclusion begins to operate slowly at first, almost imperceptibly to some, but always in a methodical and relentless way. Otto Frank understands the warning. He realizes that the political shift is not merely temporary, nor limited to rhetoric. In September of that same year, he decides to leave alone for Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where he opens a branch of Opekta, a company specializing in the production of pectin, used in making jam. Edith and the girls arrive soon afterward, leaving behind the house, their friends, and the city where they had built their lives up to that point. The Franks are among the approximately 300,000 Jews who fled Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1939, seeking refuge in other countries in Europe and beyond. In Amsterdam, the girls enroll in Dutch schools, make new friends, learn the language, and try to adapt to the new routine. Life takes on a different rhythm, more uncertain, but still possible. In the year 1938, Otto founds a second company, Pecticon, expanding his business activities. Little by little, the family begins to breathe again, trying to rebuild what had been interrupted. But unfortunately, that sense of peace would not last forever. Then, on May 10, 1940, the German invasion begins. German aircraft start crossing into the Netherlands, and the sound of engines in the sky interrupts the routine of thousands of families who were still trying to preserve some sense of normality amid the growing tension in Europe. The Luftwaffe uses paratroopers to seize strategic points on Dutch soil, while air raids strike major cities. The bombing of Rotterdam is devastating. Much of the city's historic center is destroyed within a matter of hours, in an attack that leaves the world in shock at the speed and scale of the destruction. Faced with the threat that Utrecht will be the next target, Dutch forces surrender on May 15th after only 5 days of fighting. Anne Frank is 10 years old. The regime her family had left behind in 1933 catches up with them again, in the very place they had chosen as a home, as a refuge, as a new beginning. What had seemed distant, confined to memories of Germany, becomes part of daily life again with frightening speed. The Nazi occupation does not take long to show its true intent. Jewish civil servants are dismissed from their positions. Businesses owned by Jews have to be registered and are gradually confiscated. Parks, cinemas, and establishments frequented by non-Jews become off-limits. Anne is forced to leave her school and attend an exclusively Jewish institution, separating her from classmates with whom she had formed bonds in the previous years. Within a few months, virtually every sphere of daily life is subjected to some kind of restriction for the Jewish population, from the right to enter certain public spaces to the freedom to move through the streets. But, as they say, nothing is ever so bad that it cannot get worse. In 1941, the situation grew even worse. Jewish men began to be arrested during nighttime raids and deported to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Among those captured were friends and acquaintances of the Frank family. Shortly afterward, reports of deaths began to arrive, spreading fear and uncertainty among those who still remained free. Otto Frank tried to obtain visas for the United States and Cuba in the hope of leaving Europe with his family before it was too late. The problem was that the applications were denied. A new law came into force in the Netherlands in 1942. All Jews were required to sew a yellow, six-pointed star onto their clothing. Starting on the 5th of May, anyone found without the symbol could be arrested and detained for up to 6 weeks. The emblem, which had once represented faith, was turned into an instrument of public humiliation and social control. She turned 13 on the 12th of June, 1942. Among the gifts, she received a red and white checkered diary. She began writing in it immediately that same day, recording thoughts, feelings, and events she could not share with anyone else. It was the last birthday she would celebrate in freedom. The summons and the hiding place. Still in June of 1942, someone in the family was about to receive terrible news. It was not Otto, but Margot. She had been summoned by the Nazis and was to report to one of the Third Reich's labor camps. The Franks knew exactly what that would mean. They had heard the stories. They had also seen many friends disappear from one day to the next, without explanation, without a chance to say goodbye. So they decided to flee. They took everything they could carry and walked to number 263 Prinsengracht, the address of Otto's office in Amsterdam. At the back of the building, reached through a carefully positioned revolving bookcase, was a set of hidden rooms. Otto had prepared that place in secret during the previous months, anticipating that at some point there would be no other choice. It would be their home for the next 761 days. A week later, the Van Pels family arrived. Herman, Augusta, and the young Peter, who was 16. The space, already extremely limited, would have to be shared, and in November of 1942, Fritz Pfeffer joined them, a dentist and a friend of the family. 8 people, 3 floors, and no ability to make noise between 8:30 and 5:30, while the workers in the warehouse below were present. During those hours, even heavier footsteps could be dangerous. Survival depended on 6 helpers: Niep Gies, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, Bep Vascuel, and other Opekta employees. They risked their own lives every day, bringing food, clothes, and news from the outside world. The punishment for hiding Jews was death. When the workers went out for lunch, some of the helpers would go up to the secret annex. It was the most eagerly awaited moment of the day. They could talk a little louder, move around with a little more freedom, and sometimes listen to Radio Oranje, where Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, exiled in England, sent messages of hope to the Dutch people. Anne wrote in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. The diary was her only real space of freedom. She recorded her conflicts with the Van Dans, her growing closeness to Peter, her arguments with her mother, her admiration for her father, and her dreams of becoming a writer and journalist. She even rewrote parts of the diary when, in March of 1944, she heard on the radio that the Dutch Minister of Education was asking citizens to preserve personal documents about the occupation. Anne imagined that her writings might one day have historical value, and she had no idea how right she was. Well, before we continue with today's video, tell us here in the comments what you're thinking about today's story. Did you already know these details about Anne Frank's journey? And what other topics would you like to see here? Your opinion is very important, so we can keep bringing you better and better content. Also, take a moment to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like to support our work. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep growing here on the platform. Okay? Now let's find out what happened to the Frank family. The beginning of the tragedy. It was an ordinary Friday, August 4th, 1944. It was still morning when a car stopped in front of number 263 on Prinsengracht. Dutch police officers, under the command of SS officer Karl Silberbauer, entered the building after receiving an anonymous tip. To this day, the identity of the informant has never been officially confirmed. Silberbauer and his men went up to the secret annex. The people hiding there were found. There was no resistance. The children, who had survived for more than 2 years in almost complete silence, had nowhere to run and no way to react to that unexpected presence. Silberbauer confiscated money and valuables. Papers and notebooks were scattered across the floor during the search. Among them were Anne Frank's diary and other manuscripts as well. When the 8 prisoners were taken away, 2 of the helpers, Niep Gies and Bep Vascuel, went up to the annex and gathered the documents before the Nazis cleared out the place completely. That gesture would preserve Anne Frank's memory. The prisoners were then taken to Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam, and from there transferred to the transit camp at Westerbork in the north of the Netherlands. The conditions were harsh, but still bearable compared with what would come later. Men and women were separated during the day and forced to carry out different tasks. At night, Otto could still see Edith, Margot, and Anne. It was the last period in which the family would remain relatively together. Until, in September of 1944, a train left Westerbork bound for Auschwitz-Birkenau. The prisoners were transported in cattle cars, with more than 10,000 people crammed into tiny spaces, without proper ventilation, with little water, and only a single barrel to serve as a shared toilet. The journey lasted 3 days. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, they were subjected to selection. Nazi doctors assessed who was fit for forced labor and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. According to records from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, around 350 people from Anne's transport were murdered as soon as they disembarked. Among them were children, the elderly, and people already weakened by the journey. Anne, Margot, and Edith were sent to the women's labor camp. Otto was separated from them at that moment. He never saw them again. According to testimony from survivors collected after the war, the three Frank women became inseparable companions in Auschwitz. They protected one another, shared the little they had, and tried to stay close whenever possible. But as we already know, Auschwitz was not built to preserve humanity. The last winter. We have now reached the beginning of November 1944. Anne and Margot were selected and deported to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Edith was left behind in Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the family's final separation. Then, on January 6, 1945, Edith Frank died of exhaustion and illness. Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz 3 weeks later. Unfortunately, she did not survive to see the liberation. In the final months of the war, Bergen-Belsen was one of the most devastating places in Europe. The camp had originally been built for prisoners of war, but throughout 1944 and 1945, it became increasingly overcrowded with Jews transferred from other camps as the Third Reich retreated. Between January and March of 1945, trains arrived carrying prisoners from the so-called death marches, columns of prisoners forced to walk for kilometers in bitter cold, hunger, and constant violence. According to British records from the time, about 1/3 of the prisoners were already dead when they arrived. Of those who were still alive, nearly 80% had to be carried by truck from the railway stations, unable even to walk. In a single transport of 1,000 prisoners, more than 500 arrived lifeless. Inside the camp, the conditions were practically indescribable. The intense cold of the German winter punished bodies that were already weakened. In overcrowded barracks where many slept directly on the ground because there were not enough beds. About 200 blankets for tens of thousands of people. Almost no food, and not enough water even to drink, much less to maintain any basic hygiene. And in that scene of abandonment, a typhus epidemic spread completely unchecked. The daily death rate in Bergen-Belsen, according to British military reports compiled after the liberation, ranged between 250 and 300 deaths a day. Anne Frank and Margot were in that camp. Nanette Blitz was Anne Frank's childhood friend. The two had attended the same school in Amsterdam before the war. In Bergen-Belsen, they met again not as classmates, but as prisoners. In her testimony, preserved by the Anne Frank House, Nanette described what she saw. Anne was bald, malnourished, and trembling. The energy that had defined that girl for years, the constant curiosity, the easy laughter, the desire to write about everything, seemed to have disappeared. In its place was someone who was barely recognizable, physically frail and emotionally exhausted. She told Nanette that she believed her parents were dead. She also said that she no longer wanted to live, but added one thing she still hoped for when the war ended: to write a book based on her diary. Even there, amid the collapse, the idea of turning her words into something greater still survived. Gina Turgel, another survivor of Bergen-Belsen who worked in the camp's makeshift hospital, also later recalled Anne in a testimony. She described her as being in critical condition, delirious, with a high fever, burning up from within. Gina brought her water so she could wash. That was what she was able to do for her at that moment. A simple gesture, almost minimal, but profoundly human. It was not enough. Then came the deaths. Margot died first, weakened beyond what her body could bear. She fell from the bunk during the night. The impact, combined with the extreme state of debility she was in, proved fatal. Anne died soon afterward, the next day or a few days later. Accounts vary. Both sisters succumbed to typhus sometime in February 1945. For a long time, it was believed that the sisters had died shortly before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945. Later research, including analyses carried out by the Anne Frank House, indicates that their deaths most likely occurred weeks earlier, still in February, when conditions in the camp were at the height of collapse. Anne Frank was only 15 years old. Otto, her father, managed to survive. She and Margot were buried in mass graves, like millions of other victims of the Holocaust. They were reduced to numbers in reports, to names on transport lists, and to silence. Otto's fate. Soviet troops managed to liberate Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. Anne's father, Otto Frank, was there. He made the long journey back to the Netherlands, arriving on June 3, 1945, 9 days before what would have been Anne's 16th birthday. Along the way, he learned that Edith had died. Even so, he held on to the hope that his daughters were alive in some other camp, waiting to be rescued. In July 1945, that wait came to an end. Miep Gies was waiting for Otto with a box of documents she had gathered from the floor of the Secret Annex on that day in August 1944. She had kept them without reading them, hoping to return them to Anne herself. Now she handed them over to the family's only survivor. Otto took weeks to find the courage to read. When he finally did, he discovered a daughter he had never fully known. Her depths, her inner conflicts, her lucid and, at the same time, generous view of the world around her. He discovered a writer, and he also discovered her expressed wish that her stories might one day be published. And that is exactly what happened. In 1947, the first 3,000 copies of Het Achterhuis, known worldwide as The Diary of Anne Frank, were published in the Netherlands. Since then, the book has been translated into more than 70 languages and has become one of the most beautiful works in contemporary history. In 1960, the building at Prinsengracht 263 was turned into a museum, the Anne Frank House. There, it is still possible to see Anne's room, with the walls covered in the photos and postcards she collected. Alongside the original notebooks in which she wrote her last words while still free, there is a passage from the diary written on July 15, 1944, just 3 weeks before the arrest, that Otto Frank would quote in interviews throughout the rest of his adult life. Anne wrote that, in spite of everything, she still believed that people were truly good at heart. She was wrong about much of what would come afterward, but it is possible that she was right about that. And perhaps that is why we still return to her words, not to find ready-made answers, but to remind ourselves that the question remains urgent. How can we stop this from happening again in the future? Anne Frank died in February of 1945, but her voice was never truly silenced. We have reached the end of another video, and today's topic was undoubtedly quite intense. But tell me, did you already know Anne Frank's story? Have you had the chance to read her diary? Leave your comment below. We'd really like to know your opinion and also get to know you better, those of you who follow our content. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end. Before you go, check whether you're already subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on. That helps us a lot keep producing new content. And if you can, take a look at the other content available here. See you in the next video. A big hug, and see you then.